Section 5 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 5. Solon, Part 2. Solon used to say to his friends that at 60 years of age a man ought neither to fear death nor complain of the ills of life; that courtiers were like counters used in calculating, for that they represented more or less, accordingly as the fancy of the monarch chose to place them; that those who were admitted into the confidence of princes ought not to advise them to what might be most agreeable, but what was most fitting for them; that we can have no better guide of conduct than our reason, and that we ought neither to say nor do anything without consulting it; that a man's probity is more to be regarded than his oath; that friendships ought not to be contracted on light foundations, but that when once formed they could not be broken without danger; that the safest and quickest way of repelling injury was to forget it; that no man ought to attempt to command until he shall have learned to obey; that falsehood ought to be treated with universal abhorrence; and finally, that the gods ought to be honored, parents reverenced, and no intercourse held with the wicked. Solon, perceiving that Pisistratus was forming a large party in Athens, and taking steps to secure the sovereignty to himself, used his utmost efforts to frustrate his measures. Assembling the people in the market‐place, he appeared among them completely armed, and unfolded to them the design of Pisistratus. "Athenians," said he, "I am wiser than those who are ignorant of the base intentions of Pisistratus, and braver than those who are acquainted with them, and yet from fear and pusillanimity dare not venture to oppose them. I am ready to put myself at your head, and gladly will I expose my life in defense of liberty." The people, however, being inclined to look favorably upon Pisistratus, treated Solon in this instance as if they still believed him to be deprived of reason. Some days after, Pisistratus wounded himself, and whilst the blood was yet streaming from him, he gave orders to be taken in that condition into the middle of the market‐place, and gave out that his enemies had treacherously fallen upon him, and reduced him to the miserable state in which they saw him. The populace immediately fired at this declaration, and were ready to take up arms in favor of Pisistratus. "O son of Hippocrates," said Solon to him, "you play the part of Ulysses very well. He wounded himself to deceive his enemies, but you wound yourself to deceive your friends." The people, however, had all assembled together. Pisistratus desired to have a guard of 50 men. Solon warmly remonstrated against so dangerous an innovation, pointing out to his countrymen all the evil consequences with which it might be fraught. But his arguments had no effect on the infatuated populace, who not only gave Pisistratus a guard of 400 men, but also granted him leave to raise troops for the purpose of making himself master of the citadel. The chief citizens were struck with consternation at this measure, and every one, whatever party he might belong to, began to think of retiring. Solon remained undaunted, and reproached the citizens with their baseness and cowardice. "It was easy for you to have prevented this tyranny from ever taking place," said he, "but there will be the more glory for you now that it is established, in abolishing and extirpating it entirely." When he saw that all he could say had no effect in recovering his countrymen from the panic that had seized them, he went home, took his arms, carried them to the door of the Senate house, and resting them against it, exclaimed, O my beloved country, I have served thee, both in word and deed, to the utmost of my power. I take the gods to witness that I have neglected nothing in defence of thy liberties and laws. But now I stand alone in my opposition to the tyrant. All my countrymen are willing to acknowledge him as their master. Therefore I depart. I leave thee for ever. Solon, being unable to conquer his repugnance to obeying Pisistratus, and fearing that the Athenians might even compel him to alter his own laws, notwithstanding that they had bound themselves by oath to observe them, preferred rather a voluntary exile from his native country, with the pleasure of travelling and increasing his knowledge of the world, than to lead an unpleasant life at Athens. He accordingly travelled into Egypt, where he resided some time at the court of Amasis. Pisistratus held Solon in the highest estimation, and was much hurt at his thus estranging himself from his native country. In order to tempt him to return, he wrote him the following conciliatory epistle: I am not the first Greek who has been invested with the sovereignty of his country, nor can I think that I am acting in any respect against the laws or against religion. I am descended from Codrus, and the Athenians solemnly swore that they would preserve the kingdom for his posterity. One of my chief cares is to see that your laws shall be carried into execution with more exactness than if the state were governed by the populace. I am contented with the taxes as I found them already established, and with the exception of such honors as are due to the dignity of my station, I am in no way to be distinguished from the humblest citizen. I harbor not the slightest resentment against you for having laid open my designs. I am persuaded that in so doing you were influenced by love for your country rather than by enmity towards me, and this because you could not possibly know beforehand how I might conduct myself; for had you known it, you probably would not have disapproved of my enterprise. You may return, then, with the most perfect confidence, for rest assured that Solon can never have anything to fear from Pisistratus. Even those whom I have considered as my enemies have never experienced any rigor of resentment from me. But you I am willing to regard as my best friend, and you shall be always treated by me with the utmost consideration, because I know you to be incapable of any breach of faith. Nevertheless, should you have any private reasons that may prevent your returning to Athens, I shall be satisfied with your taking up your abode in any spot that may be agreeable to you. I shall be contented, provided I know myself not to be the occasion of your exile. To this letter Solon made the following reply: I can believe that you intend me no ill, for until you became a tyrant I was your friend, nor ought I to be reckoned less so now than any other person who detests tyranny. I leave to every one the free right of forming his own opinions, whether it be more desirable for Athenians to be governed by one absolute ruler, or by the authority of a certain number of magistrates. I am willing to acknowledge that among tyrants you may be the best, but I cannot think of returning to Athens, for after having established a free government in that city, and refused the sovereignty that was offered to me, I might with reason be blamed and accused of favoring your usurpation, should I appear contented to live under it. Solon wrote another letter to Epimenides in the following words: As my laws were not destined to produce any lasting service, neither has any essential benefit resulted to Athens from the transgression of them. It is not in the power of legislators, or even of the gods themselves, to serve a state, except those by whose direction it is governed are actuated by good intentions. My laws have been of no avail, but those who have violated them have ruined the republic by suffering Pisistratus to usurp the sovereign power. I foretold all that has happened, but I was not believed. Pisistratus, by flattering the Athenians, made them think him more attached to their interests than I was, because I told them the truth. I offered to put myself at the head of the citizens in order to prevent the evils that have now come to pass, but I was treated as a madman. Whilst to Pisistratus they granted guards, through whose assistance he has brought the whole city into bondage. What then remains for me but to withdraw myself? Croesus, king of Lydia, having rendered all the Asiatic Greeks tributary to him, many of the most powerful people of that age left Greece, on one pretext or another, and went to reside at Sardis, the capital of the empire of Croesus. That city was then flourishing in wealth and honor. Croesus heard everybody speak of Solon in such high terms that he conceived a great desire to see him. Accordingly he sent him an invitation to come and take up his abode at his court. Solon returned the following answer: I fully appreciate the friendship which you have manifested for me, and I can call the gods to witness that if I had not long since resolved to live only in a free state, I would prefer your kingdom to Athens itself, whilst Pisistratus continues to exercise his tyrannic sway in that city. But the modes of life which I have adopted are to be enjoyed in tranquillity only, in a place where all are on equal footing. I shall nevertheless pay you a visit, in order to have the pleasure of spending some time with you. Solon accordingly set out to Sardis at the request of Croesus, who manifested the greatest impatience to see him. In passing through Lydia, he met a number of persons of consideration, with magnificent trains of attendants. He imagined of every one he saw that he must be the king himself. At length he was ushered into the presence of Croesus, whom he found eagerly expecting him, seated on his throne and arrayed in his most gorgeous apparel. Solon betrayed no astonishment at the sight of so much splendor. My guest, said Croesus, fame has spoken of thy wisdom. I know that thou hast travelled far and near, and hast thou ever yet beheld one arrayed in robes so rich as mine? Yes, replied Solon. Peacocks, pheasants, and dunghill cocks are arrayed in richer still. The brilliancy of theirs is the free gift of nature, and they have no trouble in putting them on. Croesus was amazed at an answer so unexpected. He commanded his attendants to lay all his treasures open before Solon, and display whatever he had most precious in his palace. After this he invited him a second time into his presence. Have you ever seen, said he to him, a man more fortunate than myself? Yes, replied Solon, I esteem Tellus to be a more fortunate man. He lived respected as an Athenian citizen in a well-regulated republic. He has left behind him 2 children, comfortably provided for and much esteemed, and he himself died sword in hand, and in the act of achieving a victory for his native country. The Athenians have paid the most distinguished honors to his memory, and have raised a monument to him in the very place where he lost his life. Croesus was not less astonished at this reply than he had been at the former one. He now began to imagine Solon was not so wise as he had fancied. Well, said he, and who may be the next happy man in your estimation after Tullus? They were formerly, answered he, 2 brothers. The name of one was Cleobus, and of the other Bito. Their strength was such that they always bore away the palm of victory in whatever combats they might engage, and their attachment to each other was perfect. One day, it being a festival, their mother, who was a priestess of Juno, was obliged to go to the temple in order to offer sacrifice. Some delay occurred with respect to bringing the oxen for her chariot. The time drew near, they came not, and Cleobus and Beetle therefore yoked themselves to the car, and drew their mother to the place of her destination. The people loaded them with benedictions, and their mother, transported with joy, supplicated the goddess to grant them whatever would be most advantageous for them. When the sacrifice was finished, they made a cheerful repast, went to bed, and both of them died that same night. Croesus could not hide his indignation. How! he exclaimed, do you allow no place for me then among the number of the happy? O King of Lydia, replied Solon, you possess abundant riches, and rule over many nations. But human life is subject to so many vicissitudes, that it is impossible to decide on the happiness of any man's career until it shall be at an end. Every day some unexpected change of circumstance occurs. This we all experience. How then shall we say on whose brows the wealth of victory shall be placed, until the combat itself be finished? This view of the subject did not render it more agreeable to Croesus. He gave Solon leave to depart, and never again expressed a desire to behold him. Aesop, who was in that time in Sardis, having been sent for to that city to amuse the king, was much mortified at the reception which the monarch had given to a man so distinguished as Solon. We must either never approach princes, said he to him, or else we must resolve only to tell them what they may be satisfied to hear. On the contrary, said Solon, whenever they are approached, it ought to be with good counsel on the lips, nor ought they ever to hear anything but the truth. Cyrus had detained his maternal grandfather, Astyages, in imprisonment, and had deprived him of his territories. Croesus was angry at this conduct, and, taking up arms for Astyages, made war upon Persia. Possessed of immense resources, and seeing himself at the head of a nation esteemed the most warlike in the world, he fancied he must carry everything before him. Nevertheless, he was defeated with considerable loss, and being obliged to retreat to Sardis, he was besieged in that city, and made prisoner after a resistance of 14 days. He was taken before Cyrus, who commanded him to be loaded with chains, and burnt along with 14 Lydian youths in the presence of the king and all the Persians. He was immediately raised upon the summit of a pile of wood, and bound in the midst of his fellow sufferers. At the moment that the pile was about to be fired, Croesus, in this deplorable situation, recollected the discourse he had formerly held with Solon. Sighing bitterly, he exclaimed, O Solon! 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 Cyrus was surprised, and inquired if it were some god whom he thus invoked in his misfortunes. Croesus at first made no reply, but being compelled to speak, I called, said he, on one whom kings ought to have always near them, and whose converse they ought to value above all their pomp and riches. He was urged to explain himself more particularly. I mean a wise man of Greece, he continued, whom I formerly sent for expressly to dazzle him with the sight of my magnificence. He told me calmly, as if willing to convince me that it was all merely empty vanity, that I must wait for the end of my life, and not presume too much on the happiness of my existence, subjected in its very nature to an infinite number of calamities. It is now that I feel the full force of all that he said to me. Whilst Croesus was yet speaking, the pile had been kindled, and the flames were beginning to rise. Cyrus was touched with his words. The deplorable condition of a prince once so powerful made him look into his own heart. He dreaded lest some similar reverse of fortune might be in store for himself. He ordered that the flames should be immediately extinguished and the chains of Croesus taken off. He then conferred all possible honors upon him, and consulted him on all matters of importance. After leaving Croesus, Solon had retired into Cilicia, where he built a city which he named Solo. Learning that Pisistratus maintained his sway in a very oppressive manner, and that the Athenians greatly repented of not having opposed his usurpation, Solon wrote to them in the following words: You act with great injustice in accusing the gods as being the cause of your calamities. Whatever you may be suffering, you have only to blame your own instability and folly in not listening to the counsels of those who were well wishers to their country, and in suffering yourselves to be cajoled by the fine speeches and artful schemes of one who meant only to deceive. You granted Pisistratus permission to levy troops for his guard, and your reward is that you will be held in bondage by them for the remainder of your days. Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, wishing for the advice of Solon, laid open to him the situation of his affairs, and entreated that he would counsel him how to act. Solon returned him the following answer: You write to me that a number of persons have conspired against you. But could you even cut off all those whom you suspect of being your enemies, you would not find your safety rest on much surer grounds. Those whom you now consider as your friends will next lay snares for you. Some will distrust you on your own account, others will be offended with you for the distrust you may evince of them. Others again will think that in aiming a blow at your life they render a lasting benefit to their country. The surest way to make yourself easy is to renounce the government entirely. But if you have not resolution to give it up, then call in foreign troops sufficiently numerous to keep the country in awe, by which means you may rid yourself of your alarms, and moreover you will not be reduced of the necessity of banishing your own subjects. Solon after this travelled through Cyprus. He formed a friendship in that country with Philocyprus, king of Aepia. This city stood in a very barren part of the country. Solon advised Philocyprus to transfer the site of it to a more favorable situation. He chose a lovely and fertile plain, and superintended the building of it in person. The result was as favorable as could be desired, and Philocyprus, out of gratitude to him, called the city Solo. Solon throughout his life was no enemy to pleasure. He liked social entertainments, music, and everything that could contribute to render life happy. But he disliked representations wherein the sole object was to please by uttering popular sentiments. He thought them pernicious to the republic, and likely to breed dissensions in the state. At the time that Solon was held in the greatest estimation at Athens, Thespis began to act tragedies in his own composition. The people were mightily delighted with them, as they were a species of entertainment entirely new. Solon, who was fond of amusement, went one day to see him perform. When all was over, he asked Thespis if he was not ashamed to utter so many falsities in the face of the world. Not at all, replied Thespis, for I mean only to amuse by them, and not to injure. Yes, returned Solon, forcibly striking the ground with his stick, but if we admit falsehood into our amusements, and treat it as a jest, we shall soon find it creeping into our public business and most serious actions. It was some time after this that Pisistratus had recourse to the stratagem of presenting himself wounded and bleeding to the people. Solon then exclaimed, in allusion to these theatrical representations, "This is one of the fatal evils which may be traced to the foolish fictions I condemned." By some the establishment of the Areopagus has been attributed to Solon. It was a council composed of such as had passed through every gradation of office in Athens. Solon was asked one day what state he thought the best regulated. That, said he, wherein men, without being any way injured themselves, resent any injury done to another as warmly as if they had been the sufferers of it. Towards the latter part of his life, Solon began a poem on the island of Atlantis, which had been described to him whilst he was in Egypt as situated beyond the known ocean. Death, however, prevented the completion of his design. He breathed his last in Cyprus in the 55th Olympiad, and about the 80th year of his age. Before he expired, he gave orders that his bones should be carried to Salamis and burnt, and the ashes scattered over the face of the country. After his death, the Athenians erected a statue of bronze to his memory, which represented him with his code of laws in his hand, and habited as a prince of the people. The inhabitants of Salamis likewise erected one of him, in the attitude of an orator haranguing the people, and with his hands concealed in the folds of his robe. End of section 5. Section 6 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 6. Pittacus. Pittacus flourished in the 42nd Olympiad, and died in the 3rd year of the 52nd, aged 70 years. Pittacus, the son of Cyradius the Thracian, was born at Mytilene, a small town in the island of Lesbos, about the 29th Olympiad. In his youth he was very enterprising, a brave soldier, a skilful officer, and uniformly a good citizen. His rule of conduct was to accommodate himself to circumstances, and never to neglect opportunity. His first enterprise was in league with the brother of Alcaeus against the tyrant Melanchios, who had usurped the sovereignty of the island of Lesbos. Pittacus defeated him, and fixed his reputation as a hero by the act. The Mytileans had long carried on a destructive war with the Athenians for the possession of a territory called Aquileia. The Mytileans appointed Pittacus to the command of their troops. When the two armies came in sight of each other and were about to begin the attack, Pittacus offered to decide the matter in dispute by single combat with Fernon, the Athenian general, who was invariably successful in every species of warfare, and who had been frequently crowned at the Olympic games. Fernon accepted the challenge, and it was agreed that the victor should be acknowledged conqueror of the disputed territory. The generals came forward without any attendants, and met in the open field in presence of both armies. Pittacus had concealed a net under his buckler, and made so adroit a use of it that he threw it round Fernon at the moment when that general suspected nothing, and entangling him completely in it, he exclaimed, "I have taken a fish, not a man." He then put him to death in the sight of the assembled troops, and remained master of Aquileia. From this stratagem arose the custom of persons fighting with nets on the stage, for the amusement of the people. Age tempered the warlike spirit of Pittacus, and he gradually acquired a relish for the serene enjoyments of philosophy. The inhabitants of Mytilene, holding him in great respect, conferred on him the chief magistracy of the city. Long and painful experience taught him to view with courageous steadfastness the different aspects of fortune. After organizing the affairs of the public in the most regular manner, he voluntarily resigned the office which he had held for 11 years, and retired altogether from the turmoil of public affairs. At one period of his life Pittacus felt a great desire to attain wealth, but he afterwards learned to regard it with indifference, as beneath his consideration. The Mytileneans, in consideration of the essential services he had rendered to the state, offered him a beautiful retreat, watered by refreshing streams, sheltered by woods, adorned by vineyards, and enriched by farms, the revenue of which were sufficient to ensure him a splendid income. But he took up his javelin, and throwing it with all his strength, he said he should be contented with a portion of the estate equal to the square of the space over which his javelin had passed. The magistrate, astonished at his moderation, entreated him to tell him on what he founded it. A part is better than the whole, he replied, and this was all the explanation he would give. Croesus wrote to him one day begging him to go and see his wealth. Pittacus sent him the following answer: "You wish to tempt me into Lydia in order that I may be an eye witness of your wealth. Without seeing it at all, I am ready to acknowledge that the son of Haliartes is the most puissant of monarchs. But were all your possessions mine, they would not make me any richer than I am. Wealth is no way necessary to my happiness. I have enough to make myself and a few friends comfortable, and with that little I am contented. Nevertheless, I am very willing to pay you a visit if my doing so will afford you any gratification." Croesus, having brought the Asiatic Greeks into a state of subjugation, determined to fit out a fleet in order to make himself master of the islands. Pittacus was at that time in Sardis. Croesus asked him whether there was anything new in Greece. "The inhabitants of the island," said he, "have resolved to make war against you, and to attack Sardis itself, and for this purpose they have bought 10,000 horses." "Would that the gods," replied Croesus, "might put it into the head of the islanders to attack the Lydians with cavalry." "It seems then," said Pittacus, "that you would have no objection to meeting these islanders on horseback and on terra firma." "You are right enough in that, but do not you think that they will in return have the laugh against you, when they find that you think of bringing out a naval force against them? They will be delighted to meet you and your Lydians at sea. To them it will be the signal for avenging the wrongs of the Greeks whom you have enslaved." Croesus, imagining from this discourse of Pittacus that he must be acquainted with his schemes, thought proper to relinquish the design of fitting out a fleet against the Greek islands, instead of which he entered into an amicable alliance with them. Pittacus was deformed in person and had weak eyes. He was corpulent, and had some infirmity in his feet, which occasioned him to walk very awkwardly. And in addition to all these disadvantages, he was extremely careless in his dress. He had taken to wife the daughter of Draco, the legislator. She was a woman of excessive pride and insupportable insolence, valuing herself upon her high birth, and despising her husband on account of his appearance. One day Pittacus invited a party of philosophers to dine with him. His wife, who was constantly out of humor, went into the room when the repast was ready, and overthrew the table with all the dishes upon it. Pittacus did not betray the least anger, but contented himself with saying to his guests, "It is the act of a weak woman, we must excuse her folly." The little congeniality that existed between him and his wife inspired him, however, with the liveliest aversion to ill-assorted matches. A man went to him one day to ask his advice as to which wife he should choose from two that were offered to him, one of whom was nearly on equality with himself, the other much his superior, both in birth and fortune. "Go," said Pittacus, pointing with the stick on which he was leaning to the place he meant to describe. "Go to the corner where you see the children assembling together to play. Join them a while, and follow the advice they will presently give you." Accordingly the young man went among them. The little ones directly began to laugh and push him about, and to call out to him, "Get away, and go among your equals." This determined him to think no more of the lady who was so much above himself, but to be contented with her who was in his own rank. Pittacus was so temperate that he drank nothing but the crystal spring, though Mitylene abounded with the choicest wines ; and he secretly advised Periander to abstain from the use of wine, if he wished to succeed in his design of making himself master of Corinth, or meant to maintain himself firmly in his usurpation. He ordered that any man committing a fault in a state of intoxication should receive a double share of punishment. He often used to say that necessity was so absolute a power that the gods themselves were forced to submit to its decrees ; that it was under a republican form of government that a man could best develop the extent of his powers ; that wise men should calculate the misfortunes which may possibly happen to them, in order that they may endeavor to guard against them ; but should these come to pass, it is then the duty of a brave mind to endure them without a murmur ; that it is difficult to be a good man ; that everything that is done should be well done ; that in order to succeed in whatever we may undertake, we should design slowly and execute quickly ; that the most desirable victories were those that were obtained without bloodshed ; and that in order for a kingdom to be really well governed, the laws ought to be respected as scrupulously by the king himself and all in authority under him, as by the lowest subject. When you intend to attempt anything, said he to his disciples, never make a boast of it beforehand ; for then, if you cannot accomplish your design, you will at least have no one to laugh at you. Never reproach any one with being unfortunate, for one day you may find yourself in the same condition. Speak ill of none, not even of your enemies. Preserve your friends, but observe the same degree of caution towards them as if they were one day to be your greatest foes. Respect chastity, frugality, and truth. Reverence the gods. Acquit yourself faithfully of every trust reposed in you, and never reveal a secret confided to your keeping. Pittacus composed some verses in which he asserted that a man ought to take his bow and arrow and destroy a wicked person wherever he might find him ; for as the heart of such an one was always hollow, no confidence could ever be placed on the words that his lips might utter. Whilst Pittacus was in retirement, a large sum of money was sent him by Croesus, but he declined accepting it, coolly observing that he was already richer by one half than he would wish to be ; for in consequence of his brother having died without children, he had succeeded to his fortune. Pittacus was always prompt and happy in his replies. He was never at a loss for an answer, whatever might be the question put to him. One day he was asked, what was the most variable thing in nature? The course of water and the humor of women, was his reply. What is it that ought to be deferred as long as possible? The borrowing money of a friend. What ought we to do everywhere and at every moment? To make the best of good or evil, as each may occur. What is the most desirable? Opportunity. What most secret? Futurity. What most faithful? Land. What most treacherous? The sea. Phociacus told him that he intended to ask a gentleman for something which he had in his head. You may spare yourself the trouble, said Pittacus, of looking for it there ; you will never find it. Tyreus, the son of Pittacus, chanced one day at Cumae to be in a barber's shop, where the young men generally met to talk over the news of the day. A tradesman present thoughtlessly throwing a hatchet, it struck Tyreus on the head and clove his skull in twain. The inhabitants of Cumae seized him and brought him before the father of the deceased as a murderer. Pittacus, having made himself master of the circumstances exactly as they occurred, acquitted the man, finding that no blame could be attached to him. A fault committed unintentionally, said he, ought to be forgiven, and he who avenges it becomes in that case himself the guilty party, by unjustly punishing the innocent. Pittacus occasionally amused himself with making verse. He framed his laws and many other works in poetical measures. His favorite exercise was turning a grindstone to grind corn. He had for his disciple Paracetes, who had been reckoned by some among the sages of Greece, and whose death took place under very extraordinary circumstances. It is said that one day, when the war between the Ephesians and the Magnesians was at its height, Paracetes, who was zealous in the cause of the Ephesians, met a man on the road. He asked him to what country he belonged. The man answered that he was an Ephesian, on hearing which Paracetes said to him, "Take me by the legs, drag me into the country of the Magnesians, and then hasten back to the Ephesians. Tell them the manner in which you treated Paracetes in compliance with his own desire. Tell them also not to fail to pay me funeral honors when they shall have gained the victory." The man dragged Paracetes to the place where he had directed, and then returned to the Ephesians to relate his singular adventure. It inspired the Ephesians with the liveliest hopes. They gave battle the next day to the enemy and obtained a decisive victory. They immediately went to the spot to which Paracetes had ordered himself to be taken. There they found him dead, and his funeral obsequies were celebrated with the utmost magnificence. Pittacus himself died in the island of Lesbos, in the 52nd Olympiad, and at the 70th year of his age. End of section 6. Section 7 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 7. Bias. Bias, a contemporary of Pittacus, flourished during the reigns of Haliartes and Croesus his son, in Lydia. Bias of Priene, a small city in Caria, was held in much esteem in Greece during the reigns of Haliartes and Croesus, kings of Lydia, from the 40th Olympiad until the time of his death. He was an excellent citizen and a skilful politician, and in private life he was disinterested and amiable. Though born to great wealth, he lived in the simplest manner, distributing his riches among the necessitous of every description. He was accounted the most eloquent orator of the age in which he lived, and he employed his talents as he did his wealth in the cause of the poor and the afflicted, seeking no other reward than the happiness of serving his country. He would undertake no cause but that which he believed to be just. Hence it became proverbial throughout the country, when it was wished to give an idea of the justice of a cause, to say that Bias himself would undertake it. And when any one desired to praise an orator to the utmost, it was only necessary to say, Bias himself could not have done so well. Some pirates having landed near Messina in the Peloponnesus, they carried off a number of young women, and brought them to Priene to sell. Bias purchased them, took them home, treated them as his own children, bestowed gifts upon them all, and restored them to their parents. This generous action gained him much repute, that by many he was never mentioned under any other appellation than as the Prince of Sages. Shortly after this event, the fishermen of Messina took a large fish, in the belly of which they found a golden vase, whereon were engraved these words: To the wisest. The Senate of Messina met together in order to determine to whom it should be sent. The young women who had been treated with such humanity by Bias presented themselves with their parents before the assembly, and exclaimed with one voice that there could be none wiser than Bias. The Senate of Messina therefore sent him the vase. Bias examined it attentively, and after reading the inscription which was on it, he refused to accept it, saying that the title of the wisest could belong to Apollo alone. Some authors imagine that the vase here alluded to is the same as the tripod which has been spoken of in the life of Thales, and that the present anecdote has no other foundation than the circumstance of the tripod having been sent from Thales to Bias. but others maintain that it was Bias to whom it was sent in the first instance. Hylotes, king of Lydia, having taken and destroyed a number of cities in Asiatic Greece, laid siege to Priene. Bias was at that time chief magistrate of the place. He made a vigorous resistance for a considerable length of time, but seeing the city reduced to the greatest extremity for want of provisions, and finding that Haliartus was determined on succeeding in his object, he ordered 2 fine mules to be fattened, and then directed them to be driven towards the enemy's camp, as if they had strayed by accident from Priene. Haliartes, surprised to see the animals in such good condition, began to be afraid that he must relinquish the hope of reducing the place by famine. He contrived, however, to get a spy introduced into the city, and instructed him to make his observations on the actual state of the besieged. Bias pretty nearly guessed the real errand of the man. He therefore had large heaps of sand thrown up and covered thinly over with wheat. The deputy of Haliartes surveyed all this show of plenty, so skilfully was it managed, without in the least suspecting it to be a deception. Haliartes, deceived also by the stratagem, instantly on his messenger's report abandoned the idea of continuing the siege, and entered into an amicable treaty with the inhabitants. His curiosity being greatly excited respecting Bias, he sent a message, desiring to see him at his camp, to which Bias returned the following answer by the messengers: "Tell your monarch that I shall remain where I am, and that I command him to eat onions and shed tears the remainder of his days." Bias delighted in poetry. He composed above 2000 verses, which he made the vehicle of instructions how happiness might be secured in every situation, and for the most effectual means of governing a republic either in peace or war. He used to say, "Endeavor to please all the world. Universal good will gives a charm to everything in life. There can be nothing gained by showing pride and contempt to any one. Love your friends, but let it be with prudence. Always remember that it is possible they may one day become your enemies. Be equally moderate in your hatred of your enemies, for by the same rule they may one day be your friends. Do not be in haste to choose your friends, but when chosen treat them all with equal kindness, though you may have more deference to the merit of some than of others. Imitate the conduct of those whose society may reflect credit upon you, and depend upon it that the degree of reputation which your friends may enjoy will greatly enhance your own. Never be in haste to give your opinion, it is a mark of folly. Seek wisdom whilst you are young, it is the sole consolation of age. You cannot make any acquisition more valuable, it is the only good of which no reverse of fortune can ever deprive you. Anger and precipitation are the diametrical opposites of prudence. Good men are scarce, the foolish and the wicked are to be found everywhere in abundance. Be rigidly exact in the fulfilment of your promises. Speak of the gods with the reverence due to them, and be grateful to them for all the good that may be in you. Be not importune. It is better for others to insist on your receiving favors than for you to insist on their granting them. Undertake nothing rashly, but do quickly that which you have once resolved on doing. Never commend any one for his riches, if he have no other claim to praise. Live as if you were going to die the next moment, and also as if you were certain of living a great many years. A vigorous constitution is the gift of nature, wealth generally the effect of chance, but wisdom alone can enable a man to serve his country by good counsel. It must be a diseased mind that craves for impossibilities. Being asked one day what it was that flattered mankind the most, he replied, hope. What it was that pleased them the most, gain. What was the most difficult to bear, reverse of fortune. He used to say that the most unfortunate of men was he who could not bear his misfortunes as he ought. Being once in a ship with some impious persons, a furious tempest rose so suddenly that the vessel was threatened with instantaneous destruction. Terrified at the thought of death, the men, just before so impious, betook themselves to prayer and supplication of the gods. You had better keep silent, said Bias to them, for if you let the gods know you are here, we shall all inevitably go to the bottom. Another time he was asked by a person well known for his impiety what worship he thought due to the gods. Bias returned no answer. Being asked the reason for his silence, he replied, "You are inquiring about matters which no way concern you." He used to say that he would much rather be called upon to settle a dispute between parties hostile to him, than between those with whom he was in a habit of intimacy. For whichever friend the decision might be given against, he almost invariably became an enemy, whereas there was a great probability of converting an enemy into a friend after a question had been decided in his favor. Bias was one day obliged to sit in judgment on a friend for a capital offense. Before he passed sentence on him, he began to weep in presence of the whole Senate. "Why these tears?" said one of the members to him. "The fate of the criminal rests with you. On you alone depends his condemnation or his acquittal." "I weep," said Bias, "because nature requires me to compassionate the miserable, and the law commands me to silence the voice of nature." Bias never would reckon the mere goods of fortune among actual blessings. He regarded them as toys which might serve to amuse a vacant moment, but which often answered no other end than that of diverting the mind from laudable pursuits. He happened to be in Priene, his native place, when that unfortunate city was taken and plundered. All the citizens carried off whatever property they could, and fled in search of some place of refuge, where they might deposit it securely. Bias alone remained tranquilly looking on the misfortunes that desolated his native city, as if he felt them not. He was asked why he did not endeavor to secure something, as the rest of the citizens had done. "So I have," replied Bias. "I carry all I value about me." The life of Bias terminated in a manner not less honorable to his feelings than all its former course had been. Having the interest of a friend greatly at heart, he was carried into the Senate in order to defend his cause. He was at this time far advanced in years, and the exertion he made in speaking fatigued him so much that he leaned on the breast of one of his daughter's sons, who had accompanied him. When the pleader on the opposite side had finished his discourse, the judges pronounced in favor of Bias, who just lived to hear their decision, and expired immediately after in the arms of his grandson. A magnificent funeral was decreed to him by the unanimous voice of the citizens, who evinced extreme regret for his loss. A superb monument was erected to his memory, with the following inscription engraven on it: Bias was a native of Priene. Whilst he lived, he was the ornament of Ionia, and of all the maxims of the philosophers, his are the most elevated. So great was the veneration in which his memory was held, that a temple was dedicated to him in Priene, whereby the inhabitants of that city paid him extraordinary honors. Section 8 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 8. Periander. Periander, tyrant of Corinth, was contemporary with the preceding philosophers, but neither the year of his birth nor that of his death is precisely known. It is surprising enough that the Greeks should have bestowed the epithet of wise on one so weak in his conduct as Periander. They suffered themselves to be dazzled by the brilliancy of his maxims, without reflecting on the atrocity of his actions. He spoke indeed like a sage, but he lived like a madman. He kept up a criminal intercourse for a length of time with his own mother, Cratia, without any apparent sense of his own dishonor in so infamous a deed. He made a vow one day that if he should gain the prize at the Olympic games, he would erect a statue of gold to the honor of Jupiter. He came off victorious in the next games that were celebrated, but not having sufficient money to acquit himself of his promise, he seized all the ornaments of the ladies who had come elegantly attired in order to do honor to the festival, and thus performed his vow at their expense. Periander was the son of Cypselus, of the family of Heraclidae, and was tyrant at Corinth, his native city, at the same time that Haliates was king of Lydia. He married Lysis, the daughter of Procleus, prince of Epidaurus. He always evinced the most passionate attachment to her, and changed her name from Lysis to Melissa, which signifies in the Greek, from which it is derived, a bee. He had 2 sons by this marriage. Cypselus, the eldest, was dull, and indeed appeared almost deficient in intellect; but Lycophron, the youngest, displayed an elevated mind, and was admirably adapted to govern a state. Some females, from interested motives, wishing to disgust Periander with his wife Melissa, who was at that time pregnant, related such calumnies against her as to excite in him the most uncontrollable jealousy, insomuch that meeting her on the staircase immediately afterwards, he gave her such a kick in the body as hurled her from the top to the bottom, and destroyed at once the mother and the infant which she carried in her womb. Instantly repenting of what he had done, and loving her to distraction, he forgot even the respect due to the dead, and throwing himself on the senseless corpse, he committed outrages upon it, for which madness itself could be no excuse. He next wreaked his vengeance on the women who had inspired his suspicions, ordering them to be seized and burnt. When Procleus, the king of Epidaurus, was made acquainted with the horrible cruelty with which his beloved daughter had been treated, he sent for his grandsons, whom he loved to the utmost tenderness. He kept them with him some time to console him under his affliction, and when he sent them back, he embraced them and said to them, "My children, you know the murderer of your mother." The eldest paid little attention to the import of these words, but they affected the youngest so powerfully that on his return to Corinth he would neither speak to his father nor make any reply when spoken to by him. Periander questioned Cypselus, his eldest son, very closely as to what had been said to them by their grandfather; but Cypselus, who had forgotten all that had passed, merely related the kind treatment they had received. Periander was, however, by no means satisfied with this answer. Conscious that something more must have occurred, he therefore pressed his son so earnestly to recollect himself, that at last Cypselus called to mind the parting words of Procleus, and repeated them to his father. Periander immediately entered into the full meaning that Procleus had intended to convey. He now resolved to compel his youngest son to acknowledge his dependence on him. He forbade any person to retain him under his roof. Lycophron, thus driven from one asylum, in vain endeavored to procure another. His father's threats had inspired a terror which closed every door against him. At last some friends took pity on him, and received him at the hazards of incurring the displeasure of the king. Periander then issued an order, denouncing the punishment of death on any one who should harbor or even speak with Lycophron. So rigorous a decree terrified all the inhabitants of Corinth, and no one was found hardy enough to hold any intercourse with the subject of it after it was issued. He was shunned as if he had been some ferocious animal, and his nights were passed in the porticos of houses. In the course of 4 days he was nearly exhausted with hunger and misery. Periander, seeing him at the point of death, was touched with pity, and went to him, saying, "O Lycophron, whether it is more desirable to drag on a life so wretched as you have rendered yours, or to submit yourself to me, and be made the master of all that I possess. You are my son, and prince of the flourishing city of Corinth. Any disaster that may happen to you will be felt by me as keenly as if it had happened to myself. But you have incurred all this suffering you now experience by angering him whom you ought to have respected. You have now experienced the fatal consequences of opposition to a father's will, and I permit you to return to your paternal roof. Lycophron, firm as a rock, listened to this speech from his father, and when it was finished, he coolly replied, "You deserve that punishment yourself for speaking to me, which you have threatened others with, should they do so." Seeing that it was impossible to subdue the resolution of his son, Periander determined to send him out of his sight, and accordingly banished him to Corcyra, a country subject to Corinth. Periander, entertaining the liveliest resentment against Proclus, whom he looked upon as the origin of the breach which had taken place between him and his son, raised troops to make war against that prince, and put himself at their head. He succeeded in all his measures, and having made himself master of Epidaurus, and taken Proclus prisoner, he retained him in confinement, though he spared his life. In the course of time, Periander, finding age come upon him, sent to Corcyra for Lycophron, intending to resign the sovereignty in his favor, and to set aside his eldest son, who was no way fitted for the cares of government. Lycophron did not vouchsafe a single word in answer to his proposition. Periander, who loved his son with the greatest tenderness, could not bear to relinquish the hope of finally prevailing on him to come into his views. He ordered his daughter to repair to Corcyra, thinking that her influence over her brother's mind might work more successful than had hitherto attended on any of his own schemes to gain over him. As soon as the young princess reached her brother, she made use of every argument which she thought most likely to move him, and make his obstinacy give way. "Would you prefer," she said, "seeing the throne filled by a stranger rather than by yourself? Power is a mistress surrounded with suitors, and naturally inconstant. Our father is now in years, and his death cannot be far distant. If you do not hasten your return, our family will be lost. Dream no longer then of abandoning to others the greatness which courts your acceptance, and which is your hereditary right." Lycophron told her, however, that he would never return to Corinth so long as her father should remain there. The princess took her leave, and acquainted the king with the resolution which Lycophron had made. Periander then sent a third message to him, purporting that his son might take possession of the throne of Corinth whenever he pleased, as he himself had determined on finishing his days at Corcyra. To this arrangement Lycophron made no opposition, and accordingly it was settled that the governments should be thus exchanged. The Corcyrans, however, being informed of it, conceived such a dread of Periander's coming to rule over them, that they killed Lycophron, in order to avert the probability of it. The death of his son plunged Periander into despair. He issued his commands that 300 children belonging to the best families in Corcyra should be seized. These he sent to Haliartus to be emasculated. The vessel in which they were embarked was compelled to touch at Samos. The inhabitants of that city, being informed of the cause which destined these unfortunate youths to Sardis, compassioned them, and secretly advised them to take sanctuary in the temple of Diana. When they had once entered hither, it was affirmed that they were under the protection of the goddess, and the Corinthians were not allowed to take them away. Without openly incurring the resentment of Periander, methods were devised to supply them with the means of subsistence. Every evening the young men and damsels of Samos were sent to dance round the temple. They were provided with cakes for the purpose, made up with honey, and threw them into the temple whilst they were dancing. The children from Corcyra picked them up and lived on them. Every day these dances recommenced, and the Corinthians at last, wearied of beholding them, returned home. Enraged at being thus disappointed in his attention to avenge his son's death according to his own fancy, Periander wished to terminate his existence, but as he was anxious that no one should know the spot where his body might lie, he devised the following contrivance to conceal it. He sent for two young men, to whom he showed a bypath, and commanded them to walk there the next night at a stated hour, to kill the first person they might meet, and to bury him instantly. Having dismissed these young men, he sent for four more, and commanded them to repair to the same place, and to kill and bury without fail two young men, whom they would meet there walking together. After this he sent for a number of others, and instructed them in the same manner to dispatch the four, and to bury them on the spot where they might fall. Having thus arranged everything to his mind, he took care to put himself in the way at the time and place he had fixed upon, and being met by the two young men whom he had selected for that purpose, he was deprived of life by them, as he had wished. The Corinthians erected an appropriate though empty monument to him, and engraved on it an epitaph in honor to his memory. Periander was the first who was attended by guards, and who changed the name of magistrate into that of tyrant, a term at that period synonymous with king, both signifying an absolute ruler. Periander did not allow his cities to be thrown open for the residence of all alike. He was greatly influenced by the advice that Thrasybulus, who on a particular occasion wrote him the following letter: I have concealed nothing from the man whom you sent to me. I took him into a cornfield, and I beat down in his sight every ear that raised its head above the rest. If you wish to maintain yourself firmly on the throne, you must follow my example. Put all the chief persons in the city to death, whether friends or enemies. An usurper ought to place no trust even in those who appear to be his warmest friends. Periander used to say that thought and labor would accomplish all things, insomuch that it had been found practicable to separate an isthmus from the continent, that no man ought to propose to himself silver or gold as the sole recompense of his actions, that the great could have no stronger security than the affection of their subjects, that no possession was more desirable than tranquillity. He held it proper to punish not only those who actually committed faults, but even those against whom the intention of committing them could be proved. Pleasures, he observed, are transient, but glory endures forever. Be temperate in prosperity and prudent in adversity. Never reveal a secret entrusted to your keeping. Let not the circumstances of your friends influence your attachment to them. That ought to be the same in adversity as in prosperity. Periander esteemed men of learning. He wrote to the most eminent sages of Greece, and invited them to come and stay some time at Corinth, as they had done at Sardis. And on their accepting his invitation, he showed them by his reception of them, and his mode of treating them, that he wished by every attention of his power to make their residence at his court agreeable to them. He reigned 40 years, and lost his life about the 42nd Olympiad. By some it has been imagined that there were two Perianders, and that the words and actions of both have been wrongly attributed to the same individual. End of section 8. Section 9 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 9. Coelho. Coelho was advanced in years in the 52nd Olympiad. Hence we may conclude him to have flourished nearly at the same time with Pittacus. Coelho flourished at Lacedaemon about the 52nd Olympiad. He was a man of an equal and resolute mind, capable of bearing prosperity or adversity with the same equanimity. He led a retired life at home, and deemed that time the most misspent which was employed in travelling about. His conduct was a picture of perfect virtue. His practice was a faithful exemplification of his precepts. His silence and singular moderation caused him to be admired by everybody. He regulated his life by one of his own maxims, that at all times a moderate pace was the safest. Towards the 55th Olympiad he was made Ephorus. This dignity at Lacedaemon served as a check upon the kingly power. His brother, who aspired to the office, became so jealous of him that he could not help betraying the resentment he felt. Coelho coolly said to him, I have been chosen because I was imagined a fitter person than you to bear the injury of being drawn from the enjoyment of leisure, overwhelmed with business, and, in short, rendered a slave. Coelho maintained that the art of divination ought not to be wholly rejected, and that much of futurity might be penetrated by the sagacity of the human mind. One day Hippocrates was sacrificing during the Olympic games. As soon as the flesh of the victims was put into cauldrons filled with cold water, the water became hot all at once, and began to boil even to running over, although there was no fire under the cauldrons. Coelho, who was present, considered this prodigy attentively. He then advised Hippocrates never to marry, and if unfortunately he were already married, to repudiate his wife without delay, and to destroy whatever children she might have brought him. Hippocrates turned his counsels into jest, and was no way deterred by them from entering into marriage, the offspring of which was Pisistratus, who afterwards usurped the sovereignty of Athens, his native country. On another occasion, Coelho, having attentively considered the quality of the soil and the situation of the island of Cythera, suddenly exclaimed before all the spectators, Would to the gods that this island had never existed, or that the waves had overwhelmed it as soon as it first appeared above them, for I foresee that it will be the ruin of the Lacedaemonian people. Coelho was not deceived. The island was taken by the Athenians some time after, and by them rendered instrumental in desolating the country. Coelho used to say that three things were difficult: to retain a secret, to endure injuries, and to employ time well. Coelho was brief and comprehensive in his discourse, hence his sayings became proverbs. Some of them were as follows: Threaten no one. Threats are the weak arguments of women. The greatest mark of wisdom is to know when to be silent, particularly at festive meetings. Never speak ill of any one, unless you are willing to be continually making enemies, and to hear the most unpleasing things said of yourself in return. Be more punctual in visiting your friends when they are in adversity than when they are in prosperity. It is better to suffer loss than to gain by unjust or dishonest transactions. Flatter no man in his adversity. A brave man ought always to be courteous, and to make himself respected rather than feared. The best policy in a state is to teach every citizen to regulate his own family properly. A man ought to choose a woman of simple habits for his wife, and not to celebrate his nuptials at an expense that may prove his ruin. We try gold and silver by a touchstone, but they are themselves the touchstones by which we may try the hearts of men. We ought to enjoy everything with moderation, in order to bear the loss of it with equanimity. Neither love nor hatred lasts forever. Love, therefore, as if you were one day to hate, and hate as if you were one day to love. Coelho caused these words to be engraved in letters of gold in the temple of Apollo at Delphos: We ought never to set our wishes on objects too much above us. He who becomes security for another never fails to lose. Periander did everything in his power to draw Coelho to Corinth, that he might profit by his counsel how to maintain himself in the sovereignty which he had usurped. Coelho answered him in the following terms: You wish to involve me in the troubles of war, and to make me live like an exile far from my native country, as if my doing so would any way contribute to your security. Rely upon it, that there is nothing less certain than the greatness of kings, and that he is the most fortunate of tyrants who has the happiness of dying in his bed. When Coelho perceived the end of his own days approaching, he collected his friends around him, and thus addressed them: My friends, you know that during the time I have been in the world, I have both said and done much. I have deliberately reviewed all my past life, and I find no action of which I need repent, except perhaps in one instance, which I now wish to lay before you, in order that I may know whether I acted well or ill in the matter. I happened once to be one of 3 persons who had to sit in judgment on a particular friend of mine, who, according to the law, had rendered himself amenable to the punishment of death. I was much embarrassed to know how to act. I saw myself called upon to condemn my friend, or to violate the laws. After seriously reflecting on the case, I resolved to have recourse to this expedient. I placed the arguments of the accused in his defence in so forcible a light to my colleagues, that they felt themselves called upon to acquit him, but I voted for his death myself, according to my own view of the act, though without assigning any reason for my opinion. Thus I acquitted myself, as it then appeared to me, of my double duty as friend and judge. But I have since felt something in my own breast which makes me doubt whether my conduct was not criminal. Coelho, loaded with years, died at Pisa through excess of joy, whilst embracing his son on his return from the Olympic games, at which he had been crowned as victor. The Lacedaemonians, after his death, erected a statue to his memory. End of section 9. Section 10 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 10. Cleobulus. Cleobulus lived between the 35th and 55th Olympiad, being contemporary and of nearly the same age with Solon. Cleobulus, though one of the least important among the sages of Greece, was one of the most happy. He was the son of Ephagoras, a descendant of Hercules, and was born at Lindus, a maritime town in the island of Rhodes, where he flourished in the reign of Croesus, king of Lydia. Cleobulus manifested uncommon wisdom even from his earliest years. His countenance was prepossessing, his figure commanding, and his strength surprising. His youth was passed according to the fashion of his time, in travelling in Egypt in order to become acquainted with philosophy. On his return he united himself in wedlock with the most amiable woman, and lived in the bosom of his family in undisturbed tranquillity. By this marriage he had a daughter, the celebrated Cleobulina, who, by the able instruction of her father, seconded by her own application, obtained a degree of learning that enabled her to puzzle the greatest philosophers of her time, especially by enigmatical questions. She was, moreover, so unassuming and affectionate that she would herself wash the feet of the friends and guests whom her father invited to his entertainments on any festival. Cleobulus, being chosen governor of the little state of Lindus, acquitted himself of his office with as much ease as if he had only had a single family to manage. He avoided everything that might involve the country in wars, and took care to keep on the most amicable terms, as well with foreigners as with citizens. The great merit of Cleobulus, in a literary point of view, was the subtlety with which he proposed, and the clearness with which he explained, all descriptions of enigmatical questions; and from him Greece became famous for the application of enigmas which he had learned in Egypt. He was the author of the following: I am the father of 12 sons, each of whom has 30 daughters of very different kinds of beauty. The complexions of some are white, of others very black. They are all immortal, yet they each die every day. By this enigma is signified the year. Cleobulus is also the author of the epitaph on the tomb of Midas, wherein he bestows extraordinary praises on that monarch. It has by some been improperly attributed to Homer, who lived long before Midas. Cleobulus held virtue principally to consist in avoiding injustice and other vices, in which opinion Horace coincides when he says: Virtue est vitium figere et sapientia, prima stultitia carusse. To fly from vice is virtue, and most wise is he who folly shuns. Cleobulus used to say that order, time, and measure ought to be observed in all things; that in order to banish the great folly of luxury which reigned in all states, every citizen ought to be required to live in conformity with his actual rank and condition; that nothing was more common in the world than great talkers and great ignorance. Endeavor, said he, always to cherish elevated sentiments, and be neither faithless nor ungrateful. Do good to both your friends and enemies. By this means you will retain the former, and may win over the latter. Before you set out from home, consider well what you are about to do, and when you return, examine with equal care all that you may have done. Speak little, and listen attentively. Utter nothing to the disparagement of any one. Always give that advice which you sincerely believe to be right. Do not abandon yourself to your pleasures. If you should have any enemies, seek to be reconciled with them. Do nothing by violence. Endeavor to educate your children properly. Never make a jest of afflictions. If fortune smile on you, do not be lifted up by it, neither suffer yourself to be cast down, should she turn her back upon you. Seek to marry in your own rank. If you choose a wife of birth superior to your own, you will find a master in each of her relations. Particular attention ought to be paid to daughters. They ought not to be allowed to marry, except they add to the youth of virgins the conduct and understanding of matrons. A man ought neither to praise his wife nor find fault with her before strangers. In one case he shows his weakness, in the other his folly. When Cleobulus understood that Solon had bidden a final leave to his native country, he did all in his power to induce him to take up his residence with himself, and wrote to him thus: You have many friends, and I doubt not that they will all gladly throw open their doors to you. For my own part, however, I believe that you would be more happy at Lindus than anywhere else. It is a maritime place, and in possession of perfect freedom. You will have nothing to fear from Pisistratus whilst you remain here, and all your friends can come to visit you in perfect security. Cleobulus was fortunate in being able to make the best of everything that fell to his lot. His condition rose not above mediocrity, but he kept himself free from the cares of the world. He was happy in every relation of life as a father, husband, citizen, and philosopher, and died at the advanced age of more than 70 years, as highly esteemed as he had been throughout his long life. The inhabitants of Lindus evinced the sincerest regret for his loss, and erected a magnificent monument to his memory, engraving on it an appropriate epitaph. Section 10. Section 11 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 11. Epimenides. Epimenides came to Athens in the 46th Olympiad. It has been pretended that he slept in a cave 57 years, and that he lived 154, or as some say, 157, or according to others, 298 years. Epimenides of Knossos flourished in the island of Crete at the time that Solon was in the zenith of his reputation at Athens. He was a man of exemplary piety, and was supposed to be the son of the nymph Built. It was generally believed in Greece that he was inspired by some celestial deity, and that he was often favored with divine revelations. He applied himself solely to poetry and to things connected with divine worship. He was the first who introduced the consecration of temples and the purification of countries, cities, and even private houses. He did not hold his countrymen in much estimation. St. Paul, in his epistle to Titus, quotes one of his verses, wherein he expresses his opinion of them. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, "The Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies." See IV 12. The father of Epimenides sent him one day into the country in search of a ewe. As he returned, he diverged a short distance from the highway towards the south, and went into a cave to take a little rest until the heat should be abated. He there fell into a sleep, which lasted 57 years. When he awoke, he looked about for his ewe, having no idea that he had been asleep for any long time. His search, however, was in vain. He then came out of the cave, and was surprised to see the face of the country entirely changed. All astonishment, he went to the place where he had caught the ewe, but he found that the house had got another master, and that no one knew anything about either him or his errand. He ran in a state of great alarm to Knossos, but at every step he took in the city he met some face he had never seen before, and his consternation every moment increased. As he was going into his father's house, he was stopped with an inquiry into his name and business, and at last, with great difficulty, he made himself known to his younger brother, whom he had left a mere child and now wrinkled with age. So extraordinary an adventure made a great noise throughout the country, and Epimenides was universally regarded as one peculiarly favored by the deities. Those who are not willing to lend their credence to this long sleep of Epimenides endeavor to explain it by imagining that he passed these 57 years in privately exploring foreign countries, and applying himself to the study of botany. Michaelides having cruelly massacred, even at the very altars, all such citizens as had adhered to the interests of Solon, the Athenians were seized with a terror which augmented every day. In addition to the affliction of the plague, which was at that time depopulating the country, a belief was entertained that the city was infested with evil spirits. Soothsayers were consulted, and they pretended to discover by their divinations that the city was in a state of pollution, owing to certain abominations which had been committed in it. The citizens, hearing this, resolved to furnish Nicias with a vessel to take him to Crete, in order to bring away Epimenides, whose reputation was now blazoned throughout Greece. As soon as Epimenides arrived at Athens, he took a number of sheep, of which some were black and others white, and led them to the Areopagus, where he left them to wander as they would. He appointed persons to follow them, and instructed those whom he selected, whenever one of the sheep should lie down, to sacrifice it on the same spot in honor of some one of the deities. Several altars dedicated to gods whose names were not known were to be seen around Athens in the time of Diogenes Laertius, by whom they are described. and which probably owed their origin to the events we are now relating. The directions of Epimenides were punctually attended to, the plague ceased almost instantaneously, and the repose of the citizens was no longer disturbed by phantoms. On his arrival at Athens, Epimenides contracted an intimate friendship with Solon, and contributed greatly to the establishment of his laws. He convinced the people of the folly of the barbarous ceremonies which were practiced at that time by the women at funerals. He accustomed the Athenians by degrees to habits of prayer and sacrifice, and inclined their minds by these means to the practice of equity and to obedience to the civil power. One day, attentively considering the port of Munitia, he exclaimed to those around him, "The future is hidden in thick clouds of darkness from the eyes of men. Alas, could the Athenians foresee the calamities which this harbor is destined to bring upon their country, they would dismantle it, even if they broke the stones in pieces with their teeth." After remaining some time at Athens, Epimenides began to make preparations for his return. The Athenians fitted out a vessel for him, and presented him with a talent of gold for his trouble. Epimenides thanked them warmly for the kindness of their intention, but would not accept of their money, contenting himself with asking their friendship, and establishing a close alliance between the Athenians and the inhabitants of Gnosus. Before he left Athens, he built a beautiful temple in that city, and consecrated it to the Furies. Epimenides endeavored to persuade the people that he was Aeacus, and that he frequently revisited the earth. No one ever saw him eat. It was said that he was fed by the nymphs who brought him manna, which he kept in a bullock's hoof, and that his manna was converted into the substance of his body without any portion of it being lost by excrement. He predicted to the Athenians the severe bondage in which they would be held by the Arcadians. It is related that one day, whilst he was building a temple, which he meant to consecrate to the nymphs, a voice from heaven was heard to say, "O Epimenides, dedicate this temple not to the nymphs, but to Jupiter himself." As soon as he heard that Solon had withdrawn himself from Athens, he sent him the following letter to console him, and to endeavor to draw him to the island of Crete. Be of good courage, my dear friend. Had Pisistratus brought under his yoke a people accustomed to servitude, or who had never lived under the influence of wholesome laws, then his power might have endured for a length of time. But he has to deal with free men, who are also men of courage. They will not long lose sight of the precepts of Solon. They will learn to blush on beholding themselves in chains, and will not suffer a tyrant to retain them in bondage. Even should Pisistratus keep his authority the whole of his life, he could never bequeath it to his children, for it is an impossibility that men, accustomed to live in a free state and under the regulation of mild and impartial laws, can ever reconcile themselves to the prospect of perpetual slavery. As to yourself, I entreat you not to waste your life in wandering from place to place. Come with all speed to Crete, where you will find no tyrants to torment you. For I greatly fear that should you by any accident fall in with the partisans of Pisistratus, a thing no way unlikely to happen, you would not receive any very courteous treatment at their hands. Epimenides passed the whole of his life in employments connected with religion. He loved poetry, and composed many works of verse. Among others, he wrote a poem on the origin of the Curetes and Corybantes, and another on the expedition to Colchis. He also composed a treatise in poem on sacrifices and on the Cretan Republic, and another work which had for its subject Minos and Rhadamanthus. Epimenides died at the age of 157, or as some maintain, at 298 years. His life was a succession of wonders, and it is on that account, perhaps, that it has been related of him that he kept awake as many days as he had slept years. The inhabitants of Crete offered sacrifices to him as a god, and in the language in general use he was styled the Quirites. The Lacedaemonians preserved his body with great care in obedience to an ancient oracle, which admonished them to do so. End of section 11. Section 12 of Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Ancient Philosophers by François Fénelon. Section 12. Anacharsis. Anacharsis came to Athens in the 47th Olympiad, and was killed shortly after his return to his own country. Hence we may conclude that he was contemporary with the majority of the philosophers already mentioned. Anacharsis the Scythian holds no inconsiderable rank among the sages. He was the brother of Cadnidas, king of Scythia, and the son of Eurus by a Greek mother, to which circumstance he was indebted for equal facility in the language of both countries. He was eloquent and vivacious, brave and steadfast in everything he undertook. He was always habited in a coarse woolen tunic, and he lived entirely on milk and cheese. His mode of speaking was concise and energetic, and as he never concealed anything, he generally gained whatever point he wished to carry. His bold and eloquent manner of delivering his sentiments procured the reputation of proverbs for his sentences, and it became common to observe of any one who affected to imitate him that he adopted the Scythian style. Anacharsis left his native country in order to take up his abode at Athens. As soon as he arrived in that city, he went to Solon's house and knocked at the door. On its being opened to him, he told the servant to inform his master that he had come on purpose to see him, and meant to stay with him some time. Solon sent him word that a man ought to play the host only in his own country, or in places connected with it. Anacharsis marched in on hearing this. Well, said he to Solon, you at any rate are in your own country and in your own house, and therefore you ought to play the host. Begin then your hospitality by showing me that you are willing we should be friends. Surprised at the vivacity of his self-invited guest, Solon consented with pleasure to his domesticating with him, and they entered into habits of friendship from that time, which remained unbroken for the remainder of their lives. Anacharsis was fond of poetry, and wrote the Laws of Scythia and a treatise on war in verse. He used to say that the vine bore 3 different kinds of grapes: pleasure, intoxication, and repentance. He was surprised to see that in all the public meetings which took place at Athens, wise men opened the business, but left it for fools to decide upon. Neither could he comprehend why slanderers and others who uttered injurious expressions should be punished, whilst boxers and wrestlers who frequently injured each other by the force and rudeness of their blows should be often munificently rewarded. He was no less surprised that the Greeks should use small cups at the commencement of their banquets, and large ones towards the end, when they were beginning to be inebriated. He could not brook the license of public feasts. Being asked what was the best method to prevent persons from giving way to a love of wine, he replied, place a drunken man before their eyes, and let them contemplate him at their leisure. He was asked if there were musical instruments in Scythia. There are not even vines, he replied. He called the oil which the athlete used for anointing themselves before they began their combats the preparation to make a madman. One day, calculating the thickness of the planks of a vessel, alas, he exclaimed, so it is, that those who trust themselves upon the water are only 4 inches from death. He was asked what vessel he deemed the safest. That which has arrived in port, he replied. He used often to say that every man ought to endeavor to the utmost to obtain complete mastery over his tongue and his appetite. He always kept his right hand on his mouth whilst he was asleep, in order to show that there is nothing which we ought to watch with so much vigilance as the tongue. One day an Athenian reproached him with his being a Scythian. My country may be a dishonor to me, he replied, but you are a dishonor to your country. He was asked what was the best and worst faculty of man. The tongue, he replied. It is better, said he, to have one friend whose fidelity may be relied on, than several whose attachment will change with every change of fortune. Being asked whether he thought the number of the living equaled that of the dead, let me know first, said he, in which class I am to reckon those who are at sea. Markets he defined to be places established by man for the purpose of defrauding each other. One day, as he was walking in the street, a young man insulted him as he passed. Anacharsis looked him in the face, and then coolly said to him, Young man, if you cannot carry wine in your mouth, you will not be able to carry water in your old age. It was he who compared laws to spider webs, and laughed at Solon for thinking to restrain the passions of men by written injunctions. To Anacharsis we owe the invention of making earthen vessels. He went one day to consult the priestess of Apollo, in order to ascertain if there were any person wiser than himself. The oracle replied that one Myson of Shiraz was wiser. Anacharsis was astonished at this, never having heard of any such person. He went immediately to a village to which he was informed he had retired, in order to inquire of him. He found him mending his plough. Myson, cried he, this is not the proper time for turning up the soil. Very likely not, replied Myson, but the proper time for mending anything is as soon as it is broken. Myson has been ranked by Plato among the wise men. He passed all his life in solitude without having any intercourse with mankind, having an aversion from his own species. He was one day seen in a sequestered nook, laughing with all his might. Being asked why he laughed so heartily when he was all alone, For that very reason, he replied. Croesus, having heard much of Anacharsis, made him an offer of money, and invited him to Sardis. Anacharsis returned him this answer: I came to Greece, O king of the Lydians, to learn the language, the customs, and the laws of the country. I have no need of either gold or silver, and I shall be quite content if I return to Scythia better informed than when I left it. Nevertheless, I shall pay you a visit, for I am desirous of being enrolled in the number of your friends. After a long stay in Greece, Anacharsis prepared for his return. On his way home he touched at Cyzicus, and found the inhabitants engaged in celebrating a solemn festival in honor of Cybele, the mother of the gods. He made a vow to the goddess to offer up the same sacrifices and establish the same worship of her in his own country, in case of his safe arrival there. Accordingly, on his return, he endeavored to substitute the laws of Greece in place of the ancient ones of his native country, by which he much displeased the Scythians. One day Anacharsis secretly went into the recesses of a thick forest in the country of Hylia, in order that he might unperceived fulfill the vow he had made to Cybele. He went through all the ceremonies, holding in his hand a tambourine before the statue of the goddess, according to the manner of the Greeks. He was observed, however, by a Scythian, who went straight to the king to inform him of all he had seen. The king immediately went into the forest, and surprised his brother Anacharsis in the act of worship. He drew his bow, and pierced him to the heart with an arrow. Anacharsis expired, exclaiming, In Greece, whither I only went to instruct myself in the learning and manners of the country, I was suffered to remain unmolested. In my native land, ignorance and envy have aimed at me a mortal wound. After his death, many statues were erected in different countries in honor of his memory. Section 13.